The day my son left for the war still plays in my mind like an old film that never fades. The morning light was soft, spilling through the kitchen window while the smell of coffee filled the room. He stood by the door, dressed in his uniform, the fabric still stiff from being newly pressed. His boots were polished, his shoulders squared, but his eyes betrayed the fear he tried to hide. I remember adjusting his collar and telling him to eat something before leaving, though neither of us could swallow a bite. The silence between us was thick, filled with everything we didn't know how to say. When the truck came down the road, he picked up his bag, and I noticed how his hands trembled ever so slightly. He looked at me one last time, and in that brief moment, I saw the boy he once was. The boy who used to climb trees and scrape his knees. The boy who'd fall asleep on my shoulder after long days at the lake. That memory hurt more than the goodbye itself. I wanted to tell him not to go, to forget the uniform and stay home, but I couldn't. I was proud, and pride has a cruel way of sounding like silence when your heart is screaming. He promised to write. He said the letters would come often, that I'd hear his voice through the words on paper. I told him I'd wait by the mailbox every morning, even if it took years. He smiled, that same half-smile he had since childhood, and said he'd make me proud. Then he turned and walked away. The sound of his boots on gravel still echoes in my mind, sharp and steady at first, then fading until there was nothing left but the wind. At the train station, the crowd was loud with whistles and goodbyes, but I heard none of it. All I could see was him, standing tall, waving, his figure shrinking as the train began to move. My throat burned, and I raised my hand one last time, forcing a smile through the ache. When the train disappeared beyond the bend, it felt like the world stopped moving. That night, I sat alone by the window, staring at the stars. I tried to convince myself it would only be a few months, maybe a year, that he'd come back with stories, medals, maybe even a family of his own. I had dreams of watching him walk up the same driveway, older but safe, calling out for me. But dreams are fragile things. They can break before you even realize they've ended. The first letter never came. Each morning, I checked the mailbox, pretending it didn't hurt when I found it empty. I told myself the war kept him busy, that soldiers couldn't always write. But deep down, I knew silence can be its own kind of message. Still, I waited. Days, weeks, months, until waiting became the only thing I knew how to do. Neighbors would ask if I'd heard from him. I'd smile weakly and say, "Any day now." Some would nod out of pity, others would change the subject. I never blamed them. People don't know how to talk about loss that has no proof, no closure. I envied those who got telegrams, even the ones that brought bad news. At least they had an ending. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch, staring down the same road he'd taken, imagining his figure coming back through the fog. Sometimes I'd set an extra plate at dinner, refusing to eat until I accepted he wasn't coming home that night, or the next. The days blurred together, seasons changed. But that space by the door, the space where he stood before leaving, stayed frozen in time. The war ended eventually. Soldiers came back, families cried tears of joy and sorrow in equal measure. But my door stayed closed, no letter, no message, no body, just silence. Some said maybe he deserted, others whispered worse things. I never listened. I couldn't. To me, he was still my boy, the one who left with courage in his heart and a promise on his lips. And so I kept my word too. I waited. Through storms, through winters, through birthdays that passed unspoken. I never gave up hope, even when everyone else did. Because when you're a father, hope isn't a choice, it's a habit. That was the last goodbye I ever gave him. One that had no return, no reply, no ending. And though I didn't know it then, life had one more twist waiting for me. One that would come not through a letter or a soldier at the door, but through something forgotten, sitting quietly on a dusty shelf, waiting for me to find it. The years that followed became a blur of silence and half-lived days. The house, once filled with laughter and noise, now echoed with nothing but my footsteps. The walls seemed to remember his voice, the way he'd shout, "Good morning," from down the hall. But those echoes faded as time did its cruel work. I would sit by the window every morning, staring at the same stretch of road, waiting for a letter carrier who no longer stopped by. The mailbox rusted, its hinges stiff, but I never replaced it. Somehow, I thought keeping it there would bring him back. The seasons came and went, each one leaving behind a new kind of ache. Spring brought the smell of rain he used to love. Summer carried the sound of distant fireworks that reminded me of gunfire, and autumn scattered the leaves that used to crunch under his boots when he'd rake the yard beside me. Winter, though, winter was the hardest. The cold always found its way in, no matter how tightly I shut the windows. It wasn't the chill of the air that bothered me, it was the emptiness it carried. People said time heals all wounds, but time never healed mine. It only taught me how to walk around the pain, how to keep busy enough so that I wouldn't hear it whisper. I threw myself into routines. I woke early, made the same black coffee, walked to the same small store, and greeted the same clerk who never asked about my family anymore. Everyone in town knew my story, but no one spoke of it. They offered sympathy through silence, and I accepted it, because speaking his name hurt too much. His room became my church. Every Sunday, I'd dust the dresser, smooth out the bed sheet, and wipe the frame of his photo. His medals hung untouched on the wall, polished to perfection, their shine mocking the emptiness below them. There were unopened envelopes, too, military forms, pension updates, reminders of a service that had taken everything and given nothing back. Sometimes I'd hold his dog tags, running my fingers over the edges, wondering if he'd ever worn them thinking of me. I remember once finding a small feather on his pillow. I don't know how it got there, but I kept it, tucked it between the pages of the Bible he left behind. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks, or maybe it was the world's quiet way of saying he was still nearby. Grief does that to you. It makes you see hope in the smallest, strangest things. Years turned into decades. The letters I once dreamed of never came. The world outside kept moving. New wars started, new leaders rose and fell. But my life stayed paused at the moment that train left the station. Friends aged, families grew, and I remained the man with the empty chair across the table. I tried to join veterans' gatherings, thinking maybe someone would recognize his name, tell me they'd served together, share a story I'd never heard. But none did. They'd glance down, mutter apologies, and move on. Eventually, the pain dulled into something quieter. Not gone, but softer, like an old wound that stopped bleeding but never truly closed. I stopped waiting by the window, stopped counting the days since his last letter, stopped telling myself stories about where he might be. Instead, I learned to live with the quiet. Some nights, though, the dreams would come back. I'd see him standing in the kitchen, grown but smiling the same way he did when he was 10, handing me a cup of coffee, saying, "I'm home, Dad." I'd wake up reaching for him, only to find cold air and an empty chair. Those mornings were the hardest because they reminded me that memory can be both a comfort and a curse. I started writing small notes to him, just to ease the heaviness inside. I'd write things like, "The garden bloomed early this year," or, "Your old baseball cap still hangs by the door." I'd place them in a drawer, as if one day he might find them. I never realized that fate was preparing a note of its own for me, one written long ago, waiting to find its way home. I didn't know it yet, but destiny was about to open a door I thought was sealed forever. It wouldn't come through a letterbox or a soldier at my doorstep. It would arrive as something simple, something anyone else might have ignored, sitting quietly on a dusty shelf in a forgotten corner of a thrift store, carrying the last words of a son who'd never stopped loving his father. Time has a strange way of punishing those who wait. It doesn't scream or rush. It just quietly takes everything from you, one piece at a time. My hair turned white, my knees grew weaker, and yet I still waited for a sound that never came. The house aged with me. The roof sagged, the wallpaper peeled, and dust began to settle in corners like memories I couldn't clean away. Every object in that house reminded me of him. the half-broken radio, his old jacket hanging by the door, the dent on the table where he'd once carved his initials. I couldn't throw anything away. To do so would feel like burying him all over again. Some nights, I'd hear the wind whistle through the window cracks, and I'd imagine it carrying whispers from the past, fragments of a voice that once called me Dad. I never remarried. People told me I should. They said I needed companionship, a reason to live again. But how could I share a home when half my heart was buried somewhere unknown? Loneliness became my oldest friend. It sat beside me during breakfast, followed me to bed, and never once left me. Faithful in a way people rarely are. I often went down to the post office, pretending to send letters even though I had no one to write to. The clerk stopped asking after the first few years. He just nodded, handed me blank envelopes, and looked away. I think he pitied me. Maybe the whole town did. They whispered about the old man who still waited for his son, the one who couldn't accept what the war had taken. But I didn't care. When you lose your child, the world's judgment becomes meaningless. Then came the photos. The government had released old war archives, rows of black and white images printed in newspapers and memorials. I searched them every week, tracing faces with my finger, hoping to find even a glimpse of him. I never did. I told myself that maybe that was a good sign. Maybe he'd survived somewhere, living a quiet life, unable to return but still breathing under the same sky. It was easier to believe in that than to imagine bones under foreign soil. The years blurred. Birthdays stopped mattering. Holidays came and went without celebration. I used to cook 2 plates at dinner, one for him, one for me. Eventually, I stopped doing that too. Eating alone reminded me too much of the empty chair across from me. I began walking more, long, slow walks to nowhere in particular. I'd pass parks where fathers played catch with their sons, and for a second, I'd forget my age. My hand would twitch like it wanted to throw a ball again. Then reality would return, heavy and cold. Those moments hurt the most, not because they reminded me of what I lost, but because they reminded me of what I'd never get back. When I reached my late 70s, I started talking to him out loud. Not out of madness, but because silence was heavier than words. I'd tell him about the weather, about the new neighbor's dog, about how the world was changing too fast. Sometimes I'd even laugh at my own jokes, imagining how he'd have rolled his eyes just like he used to. I knew he couldn't hear me, but maybe somewhere, in a place beyond pain and time, he could feel that I hadn't forgotten. Then one day, something inside me shifted. I realized I wasn't really waiting for him anymore. I was waiting for closure, for something, anything, that could tell me his story didn't just end with a question mark. I didn't want miracles. I just wanted the truth, and that truth arrived on an ordinary afternoon, not wrapped in ceremony or music, but hidden in dust and silence. It came to me through an accident, through a forgotten item meant for someone else. Fate doesn't knock loudly. Sometimes it just places a clue in your path and watches what you do with it. The day I walked into that thrift store, I wasn't looking for the past. I just wanted a distraction, something to fill the quiet for an hour or two. But as I stood between old furniture and stacks of forgotten memories, I found it, a small, weathered book. Brown leather cover, torn spine, initials carved faintly on the corner. My knees almost gave out when I saw those letters. His letters, my son's initials. For 20 years, I thought I'd never hear from him again. But that day, I held his words in my hands. Words that had traveled further than he ever could. It was a dull, gray afternoon when I decided to step outside. The rain had just stopped, and the air smelled like wet earth and rust, the kind of smell that makes old memories rise from their graves. I hadn't planned to go anywhere in particular. My legs just took me where they wanted. I ended up wandering into a part of town I hadn't visited in years, a place filled with small antique stores and forgotten thrift shops that sold other people's histories. I walked into one without even looking at the sign. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle as I entered. The air inside was thick with dust and nostalgia. Old lamps, cracked photo frames, and stacks of records leaned against each other like fragile survivors of time. I wasn't looking for anything. I just wanted to escape the weight of my house for a while. That heavy silence that never let me forget who wasn't there anymore. I moved slowly down the aisles, brushing my fingers over objects that had belonged to strangers. A child's toy car, a faded wedding photograph, a man's worn leather wallet. Every item in that store once meant something to someone. That thought always hurt a little. It reminded me of how easily love becomes clutter when time moves on. Then, on the lowest shelf of a wooden bookcase, I saw it. A small brown journal with a cracked spine and the edges of its pages yellowed from age. The cover was scuffed, but familiar. My breath caught in my throat. There, carved faintly on the corner, were two initials burned into the leather. TJ, my son's initials. For a moment, I couldn't move. The air around me seemed to vanish, replaced by a quiet ringing in my ears. My hand shook as I picked it up, afraid that if I blinked, it would disappear. I turned it over slowly, feeling the texture of the leather, the same kind my boy used to write in when he was younger. He always carried a journal, said it helped him make sense of the world. I never knew he'd taken one with him to the war. I carried it to the counter like it was made of glass. The woman behind the register looked at me with a polite smile. $3, she said softly, as if she could sense something sacred about it. I reached into my pocket with trembling hands and paid, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I stepped outside, the rain had started again, but I didn't care. I sat down on a wooden bench just outside the store. My hand shook as I untied the string that held the journal closed. The first page was blank, but the second carried his handwriting, that familiar slant, uneven but strong. The very first line made my world tilt on its axis. "If you're reading this, Dad, it means I didn't make it home." The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. My body went cold, but my heart burned. I turned the pages slowly, afraid to rush through what might be the last thing he'd ever written. Each entry was dated, spanning the early months of the war. He wrote about the noise of gunfire at night, about the friends he made and lost, about fear and hunger and courage. But in between those lines, I saw love, the kind of love that never asked for anything in return. He wrote about me, about how he missed my old stories, how he dreamed of coming back and fixing the porch steps like he'd promised. He said he carried my photo in his breast pocket because it gave him strength when everything else felt hopeless. I clutched that journal to my chest as the rain soaked through my clothes. For the first time in 20 years, I felt him near me, not as a memory, but as a voice reaching across time. The entries ended suddenly, as if he had been interrupted mid-thought. The last line read, "Tell Dad I kept my word." I didn't know what he meant at first, but it didn't matter. The message was enough. He hadn't forgotten me. He hadn't abandoned me. The silence wasn't cruelty, it was fate. I sat there for hours, reading his words over and over, until the pages grew damp from rain and tears. The people who passed by saw only an old man crying over a notebook, but to me, it was everything I had been waiting for. That day changed me. The ache I'd carried for decades began to loosen its grip. The emptiness didn't vanish, but it softened. My son had kept his promise after all. He had written back. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. Even as I sat under the awning outside the thrift shop, clutching that journal like it was made of gold, they shook with a mixture of disbelief and something I hadn't felt in years: hope. The rain kept falling, soft and steady, dripping from the edges of the roof and pooling at my feet, but I barely noticed. My world had shrunk to those fragile, water-stained pages. I ran my fingers across his handwriting again and again, tracing every word like a father trying to touch his son through time. The letters were smudged in places, perhaps from mud, perhaps from sweat or tears. I could almost see him, sitting somewhere far away, huddled under weak light, scribbling these words before another mission. It was strange. After 2 decades of silence, it was as if I could hear him breathing through the ink. The journal smelled faintly of old paper and metal, a scent I remembered from the army trunk he once packed before leaving. Every word carried weight. He didn't complain. He didn't curse the war. Instead, he wrote with calm acceptance, like a man who understood his purpose but still feared the price. There were pages filled with small sketches, the curve of mountains, the outline of a tree, and once, the faint shape of a bird. Even in the worst of it, he found beauty to hold on to. When I reached the page where he'd written, "If you're reading this, Dad, it means I didn't make it home," something in me broke. My breath caught, and I felt my chest tighten until I thought my heart would stop. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, the letter, the closure, the truth, but never like this, never so quietly, never through a dusty book forgotten in a stranger's store. The rain fell harder, my vision blurred. The words began to swim on the page, but I didn't wipe the tears away. They belonged there. They were my ink now, the continuation of his story. I kept reading. Each paragraph revealed a side of my son I'd never known. He wrote about his comrades, about how they laughed to keep the fear away, about the nights when he missed home so badly that he dreamed of our kitchen, of the smell of pancakes, of the sound of birds outside our window. He mentioned how he kept a folded photo of me in his jacket pocket and touched it before every mission. He said, "When I'm scared, I remember your voice saying, 'Come home safe, son.'" That line nearly tore me apart. I didn't even realize I'd been crying loudly until someone from the shop came outside and asked if I was okay. I nodded, unable to speak, and waved them off. No words could explain what I was feeling. Grief, pride, relief, pain, all tangled into one long exhale that I'd been holding for 20 years. When I turned the last few pages, I saw something I hadn't expected. A pressed flower, flattened and brown with age. Next to it, in tiny writing, he'd penned, "From the field near the river, the one that looks like home." My hands trembled again, but this time, they weren't weak. They were reverent. That small flower, carried through war, still existed. That meant his love had survived everything. I closed the book and held it against my chest. I must have sat there for hours, just breathing and listening to the rhythm of the rain. The pain was still there, sharp and real, but it had changed shape. It no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a scar, something that hurt, yes, but also something that proved survival. For years, I had blamed him for leaving without a word, for not writing, for vanishing into silence. But as I sat there with his journal, I realized the truth. He had written. The words just took longer to reach me. That night, I brought the journal home and placed it on his old desk. The house didn't feel as heavy anymore. The air felt different, lighter, as though the past had finally exhaled. I didn't sleep much, but for the first time in decades, the silence didn't hurt. It felt like peace. He was gone, but in those pages, he had come back. Not as a soldier, not as a ghost, but as a son who had never stopped trying to reach his father. When I opened the journal again, the next morning, the world outside was silent. The rain had stopped, leaving puddles that reflected the gray clouds above. The air smelled like renewal, that faint, clean scent that comes after a storm. I brewed a cup of coffee, sat at the table where he once did his homework, and began reading his words from the beginning. Slowly this time, letting every sentence sink into me. The handwriting was uneven, sometimes hurried, sometimes gentle. I could almost tell which days were calm and which were chaos. His first entries were simple, notes about training, the food, the cold mornings. He wrote like a man who still believed the war would be short. There was a strange innocence in those early pages, the kind you only see before the world shows you its true face. He described his friends, Miller, a boy from the South who played guitar, Harris, who always talked about his newborn daughter. He called them brothers. He said, "We don't fight for politics. We fight for each other." The further I read, the heavier the words became. He wrote about long nights without sleep, about the sound of distant explosions that shook the ground like thunder. about the smell of burning metal, the cries of men who still called for their mothers. Yet even in those moments, he never let go of hope. He wrote, "When the noise becomes too much, I picture home. The porch, the smell of coffee, the sound of Dad humming off key while reading the paper." I stopped there for a long time, just staring at those lines. I had no idea that the smallest things, my bad singing, the smell of our kitchen, had lived in his mind all that time. He had carried me through war, even when I couldn't reach him through peace. A few pages later, there was a list, not of supplies or rations, but of promises. It read, "Fix the porch, visit Mom's grave with Dad, buy a red truck, never let fear make me forget kindness. Tell Dad he was right about everything." That last one made me laugh through tears. I could hear his voice saying it with a grin, like he'd finally admitted what he'd never say out loud. It was so him, proud, stubborn, loving in his own quiet way. Then came the part that broke me all over again. He wrote about a night when everything went wrong. His unit was ambushed. The entry was hurried, written in the dark. "I don't know if I'll make it," he wrote. "But if I don't, tell Dad I wasn't scared." I remembered his stories. I remembered home. The ink trailed off halfway through the next line, as if the pen had slipped from his hand. I couldn't read further. The tears blurred the page until the words melted together. I pressed the book to my chest and closed my eyes. The house around me disappeared. Only his voice remained. I could almost feel his presence, as if he was sitting across from me again, drinking coffee and complaining about how I overcooked the eggs. It wasn't imagination. It was memory coming alive again after too long in silence. When I turned to the final page, I noticed something faintly scratched into the corner. It was a small drawing, a bird flying toward the sun. Underneath, he'd written, "Freedom isn't about winning. It's about leaving something worth remembering." That was his last message to me. His final definition of life. I closed the journal and sat there until the morning light reached across the table. The room looked different somehow, warmer, lighter. For 20 years I had filled it with sorrow, but now, for the first time, it held meaning again. My son had not vanished into history. He had left behind his heart, pressed between those pages. As I stared out the window, I realized that this book, these words, was the letter he had always meant to send. The war had taken his body, but his soul had found a way home. And in that quiet moment, I made a promise to him that I would carry his story forward, so no father would ever have to wait in silence again. That day, I finally understood something. Closure doesn't come when you stop crying. It comes when the tears start to make sense. That night, I sat in the dim glow of my living room, the journal still open on my lap. The air felt heavy, not with sadness, but with something older, deeper. Grief had worn many shapes over the years, but this one felt new. It was the weight of understanding, the ache of finally knowing what I'd been searching for all my life. I traced the ink of his final words with my fingertips until they smudged faintly against my skin. It felt like touching him again, not his face, not his hand, but his heart. When I closed the book, I didn't even realize I was crying. The tears came silently, one after another, falling onto the paper and mixing with the ones that had dried there decades ago. Father and son, two men separated by time, united in the same small circle of salt water. The house seemed to breathe around me. Every creak in the floor, every whisper of the curtains felt alive again. For years, I'd lived as though time had stopped the day he left. I hadn't moved his things, hadn't changed the photographs, hadn't dared to live beyond memory. But that night, I felt him urging me to stand, to breathe, to continue. My knees trembled as I rose from the chair, clutching the journal to my chest. I walked slowly toward his old room, the one I hadn't entered since the funeral. The door creaked open like a sigh. Dust floated in the air, catching the faint light from the hall. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. The neatly folded bedspread, the baseball cap hanging on the hook, the medals framed above his desk. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the journal again to the last page. The ink there was faint, the words almost fading into the paper. "Tell Dad I kept my word." That was it. That was his goodbye. Not a long farewell, not an apology, just a promise kept. I ran my hand across the line again and felt my body give way. I collapsed onto the bed, my body shaking with sobs that had waited 20 years to escape. It wasn't the kind of crying that comes from sadness. It was the kind that comes from release. The kind that empties you out until there's nothing left but peace. My chest ached, my breath hitched, and still the tears came. I don't know how long I lay there, clutching that book like a lifeline, whispering his name into the silence. Eventually, the exhaustion pulled me under. I must have fallen asleep, because when I opened my eyes, the morning light was creeping through the curtains. My head rested on the journal. My cheek was pressed against the cover. For the first time in decades, I had slept through the night. When I woke, I felt lighter, fragile, but whole. I made coffee, and as the aroma filled the kitchen, I realized something had changed. The grief was still there, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. It had softened into something bearable, something that felt like understanding. I carried the journal back to the living room and placed it on the table beside his photograph. For years, I had looked at that photo with nothing but pain. But now, I saw it differently. I saw pride. I saw peace. My boy had fulfilled his duty, not just as a soldier, but as a son. He had found a way to reach me, even when the world made it impossible. Later that day, I went back to the thrift store. The same woman was behind the counter. When she saw me, she smiled kindly, perhaps remembering the tears from before. I asked her where she had gotten the journal. She told me it came from an estate sale, boxes of items donated from families who didn't know what to do with old army belongings. Somehow, through all the years, through all the hands it passed, it had found its way back to me. I thanked her and walked out quietly, holding my coat tighter as the wind brushed past. The world felt wider that day, open, endless, alive. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man waiting for something. I felt like a man who had finally been given an answer. That night, I placed the journal beside my bed. Before turning off the light, I whispered, "You came home, son." And for the first time since the war, I didn't feel alone. The silence of the room was no longer empty. It was full of his words, his voice, his love. He had left the world, but somehow the world had brought him back to me, just long enough to say goodbye. The days that followed felt different. The journal sat on my bedside table, its presence both heavy and comforting, like a sleeping memory finally at peace. I woke early each morning, brewed my coffee, and opened the pages again, not to cry this time, but to listen. His words had become my routine, his voice now part of the silence I once feared. I couldn't shake the question of how the book had ended up in that thrift store. The curiosity itched at me like an unanswered letter. One afternoon, I decided to return there again. Not to buy, not to browse, but to trace the path of my son's words. The woman behind the counter recognized me immediately. Her expression softened when she saw the journal tucked under my arm. She told me she'd looked into it after our last conversation. "It came from a warehouse clearance," she explained, "part of an estate donated by an older couple who passed away years ago." I asked for a name, but she hesitated. The paperwork was limited, the trail faint. Still, I couldn't let it rest. I went home and called the town office. It took hours of patient questions and long pauses before a clerk found a matching record, an old donation made by a widow whose husband had served in the same regiment as my son. They had no children, just boxes of things collected over the years. The name meant nothing to me, but it meant everything in context. It dawned on me that someone, perhaps a fellow soldier, had carried this journal home when my boy couldn't. Maybe he had promised to return it. Maybe life got in the way. Decades passed, and in the shuffle of death and donation, the book had traveled like a ghost through attics, shelves, and moving boxes until it landed back in my hands. I sat at my kitchen table that night, journal open, tracing the brown stains on the last few pages. Maybe they weren't just age, maybe they were rain from a battlefield, or blood, or the remnants of someone else's grief. It didn't matter. What mattered was that his words had survived, through fire, mud, and time itself. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this was no coincidence. Fate has strange ways of returning what we think we've lost forever. Some people call it divine timing. Others call it luck. I just knew it felt like grace, a second chance to say goodbye after years of waiting in silence. I imagined the soldier who might have held this journal after my son. Maybe he read the first page and couldn't bring himself to deliver it. Maybe he too carried his own ghosts and couldn't face another father's pain. Or maybe he didn't even know the book's worth until it was too late. I didn't blame him. War takes more than lives. It takes the courage to speak of them afterward. The next morning, I visited the local veterans office. I showed them the journal, the service number written inside the cover, and asked if they could confirm the details. The officer behind the desk, a younger man with kind eyes, looked it up and nodded. "Yes," he said, "your son's records show he was reported missing in action, presumed dead. But this," he tapped the journal gently, "this is rare. It's a miracle it made it back to you. A miracle." That's what he called it. I walked home slowly, the winter wind cold against my face, but inside I felt warm. For the first time, my son's story had shape. It wasn't just a tragedy or a question mark in an old folder. It was proof of life, of love, of something that refused to vanish. That night, I placed the journal on a small shelf beside his photograph and his medals. I lit a candle, not for mourning, but for gratitude. The flame flickered softly, reflecting off the glass frame. It felt as though he was finally home. Not in body, but in spirit, resting in the one place he had always belonged. I slept that night without dreams, without the sound of marching or crying, just quiet, the kind that comes after the storm has passed. The next morning, when I woke and saw the candle's faint smoke curling upward, I smiled. The truth behind it all wasn't mystery or magic. It was love, still traveling, still finding its way home, even after death. In the days that followed, something inside me began to shift. The heaviness that had lived in my chest for decades was no longer there. It hadn't disappeared. It had changed shape, become something gentler. The journal had filled the hollow spaces that grief once ruled. I no longer woke up waiting for ghosts. I woke up grateful for words, for memory, for the strange mercy of time. I started taking morning walks again, tracing the same streets I used to walk with my son when he was a boy. The seasons looked different now. The trees greener, the air softer, even the sound of traffic kinder. The world had not changed. I had. The journal had given me something rare, permission to live again. I began volunteering at a small community center near the park. They had a program for veterans and families who had lost loved ones in service. Every Thursday morning, I sat at a folding table, reading aloud from the journal. I didn't mention my name or his, just the story. Faces around the room would go quiet as I read about the fear, the bravery, the love of a boy who fought not for medals, but for home. Some cried, some smiled, but all of them listened. And in their silence, I felt my son's presence again, not in the pages, but in the way his story connected strangers. He was no longer just my boy. He belonged to everyone who needed to remember that love survives war. I started donating small portions of my savings to organizations that helped veterans' children. It wasn't charity, it was continuity. I wanted my son's name, though I never spoke it aloud, to echo through the lives of others like him. If he couldn't grow old, maybe his kindness still could. The journal stayed by my bedside. Some nights, when sleep wouldn't come, I'd open it to random pages and read his words again. They no longer hurt. They healed. The ink that once broke me now built me back up. It reminded me that life doesn't end when a heartbeat stops. It ends when memory fades. And I refuse to let that happen. I even returned to the garden behind my house, the one he used to help me with before leaving for the war. It had long been overrun with weeds and wild grass. One morning, I cleared it all out. My knees ached, my back protested, but I didn't stop. By noon, the soil was clean again. I planted marigolds, his mother's favorite flowers, and beneath them I buried a small envelope. Inside was a single page from the journal, the one that read, "Don't mourn me, live for me." That garden became my new chapel. Each morning, I'd water the flowers and sit quietly, watching sunlight spill across the petals. I didn't pray anymore, not in the way I used to. My prayer was the act of living, the gentle defiance of waking up with hope. Neighbors began to stop by. Some brought coffee, others just wanted to talk. They said I looked lighter, that my house felt warmer. I smiled because they were right. I had stopped carrying death around like an anchor. My son's absence no longer defined me. His presence through that journal did. One evening, a young man from the Veterans Center came to visit. He was quiet, polite, and unsure how to start. He told me he had lost his father in combat a few years earlier. He said listening to me read the journal helped him forgive life for being unfair. "Your story gave me peace," he said. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. When he left, I realized that was my son's final lesson, that even pain, when shared with love, can heal others. As night fell, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and the journal in my lap. The air was cool, the stars faint but steady. I thought about how far the book had traveled to return home. It had crossed battlefields, generations, strangers' hands, all to find its way back to a father still waiting. And as the wind brushed through the marigolds outside, I whispered, "You made it home, son." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything I had lost and everything I had found again. Now, in the quiet stretch of my final years, I find myself telling this story often. Not to impress, not to inspire, but to remember. People say time heals all wounds. I've learned that it doesn't. It simply teaches you how to live around them. My son's absence carved a hollow in me that no one could fill. But that journal, that simple book of words, became the bridge between loss and life. I keep it on a small wooden shelf by my bed next to his photograph. The cover has aged, its leather cracked, the pages yellowed, but I wouldn't change a thing. It's proof that something once mattered deeply, that love once lived here. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is still and the clock ticks softly, I open to the first page again. His handwriting, steady and sure, greets me like a familiar voice. The ache never leaves, but it's no longer a wound, it's a scar, a reminder of love's endurance. I've told this story to many people over the years, veterans, widows, old friends who carry their own ghosts. They often ask if I ever stopped missing him. I tell them no. Missing someone is the price of having loved deeply, but I've learned something even more important. When love is real, it doesn't disappear with death. It lingers quietly, finding new ways to reach us, through dreams, through strangers, through lost journals found in dusty corners of the world. Sometimes, when I sit outside and watch the sky turn gold at sunset, I think about how he must have watched the same skies once, maybe from a camp far away, maybe under the same stars. That thought brings me peace. It reminds me that no distance, not even death, is strong enough to separate those who remember each other. The war took him, but it didn't win. Because love is undefeated. It travels. It transforms. It returns. I've come to realize that his final act wasn't dying bravely. It was writing bravely. He left behind not just a record of his pain, but a map for me to find my way out of mine. Every father should be so lucky to have a son who teaches him how to live even after he's gone. When I read the final page now, I no longer cry. I smile. The words still read, "Don't mourn me, live for me." And I do. Every day I live a little more, quietly, gently, as he asked. Sometimes I walk to the Veterans Memorial on Sundays and sit by the wall engraved with names. I run my fingers across the cold stone until I find his. I don't bring flowers anymore. Instead, I bring words. I tell him about the people his story helped, about the young man who found peace through his journal, about the garden that blooms every spring with marigolds and light. I know he hears me. I can feel it in the calm that follows, in the way the breeze seems to still when I speak. It's not imagination. It's connection, the kind that doesn't need proof. When I go home each night, I pass his room. It's no longer a shrine. It's alive again, filled with sunlight, open windows, and the scent of fresh flowers. It feels like he's home. And maybe, in some way, he is. I'm old now. My hands shake when I write, and sometimes I forget where I put my glasses. But I remember every line of that journal. I could never forget. And when my time comes, when I too must leave this world, I'll go peacefully, knowing I was loved once in a way that outlasted time. So if anyone hears this story, I hope they understand. Love doesn't end when someone stops writing to you. Sometimes it just takes a little longer to find its way back. And when it does, it changes everything. Final thought. He never wrote back when I waited, but he answered when I needed him most.